One can be a doctor, can be a patient, can be a father, you can be a parent at one time in one person. And that's where Wietse Kransfeld is going to talk about. Wietse Kransfeld from Trustbuilder. He's going to talk about using an identity-centric approach to consumer experience. Give him a big hand.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Wietse Kransfeld. I'm pre-sales engineer at Trustbuilder. So Trustbuilder is a Belgium-based software company. We're an EAM vendor, so we make products for the banking sector, for finance, for government, HR services, regarding their identity and access management. So one of the things that we see when working on identity and access management for consumers and businesses is that these worlds are getting more and more intertwined. We see a lot more new use cases and a lot of more challenges. So what we did with Forrester, I don't know if the lady is still here from Forrester, but we made an infographic to see how companies present their digital offering towards customers, how they evolve, how they get different needs along the process. And we see that most companies start as a digital developer, where they have some kind of digital offering towards their end customers, but it's like an inward-looking strategy. They look at their own applications, and they have some means of putting it out there, website, mobile application, and so on. A next step is for those companies to let other companies consume their information, their data, their services, with exposing APIs, getting federated identification to allow other users to also make use of those systems. And then the next step is connecting real companies to develop new business cases. So a lot of marketing terms on there, like ecosystem extenders and monetizing masters. I think the message that we want to bring is that companies are really looking for collaborating with other companies to create new ecosystems, to create new business models that create new and better customer engagement. And so a prime example of one of our customers is KBC in Belgium. They, like all of the banks, developed a mobile application around their core banking capabilities. So they've developed this mobile application that had transaction information, balance information, you could do small transactions and so on. But then a couple of years later, like 2 or 3 years ago, they saw that they could use this mobile application for other services as well, both public and private services, to not only help their own customers to get more out of their banking application, but also for non-core banking customers to also use their application. So it was a big insight for them that they could use these applications. Like the ones you see there, they are like both public and private. You can like buy tickets for the public transport in Belgium via your KBC banking application. You can buy tickets for the cinema, tickets for restaurants, tickets for underground and street parking, all those services that have nothing to do with core banking, you can do via the application. And if you want to use those extended applications, you don't have to be a KBC customer. And that's, of course, where they want to retain and gain new customers. So we see these new business cases popping up, not only in banking, but also in insurance, in the whole finance sector, also in HR services, where they work together with mobility providers. I don't know who's driving electric, but I know that, in Belgium at least, it's a huge problem with having one card that works with all the chargers. It's a nightmare. So now you get these new business cases with combining a lot of these programs into one offering, also through KBC. So it's really like a starter platform to gain and retain more customers. That's on the application side, so that's on the KBC side. The other side, we have the identity providers. So we've talked a lot about the e-wallet, about Fast ID. We have talked about a lot of identity providers. We have Signicat here as well that uses these identity providers to broker them to a larger audience, to a larger set of service providers. And the goal, of course, for companies is to use these identity providers, but also make them work into their environment. The ultimate goal is to identify a user, but also give them access to the correct applications. And that's really where Trustbuilder helps these organizations to use any of the identity providers that they want, but also give them access to their applications in the backend. Now, with these applications, I don't want to get too technical, but if it's like a modern application and it's API friendly, it's OAuth, it's OpenID Connect, or it's SAML, then we're laughing. Then everybody can do it. The problem is in HR business cases, in banking business cases, it's usually not that way. So there we really help customers to make the best out of those identity providers, also upcoming identity providers. Because customers might say, yeah, I don't need this. I don't need this ecosystem. But what if your business wants it next year? Then you need to make sure that your IAM environment doesn't become the bottleneck to get these new business cases for your consumers. And so that's a bit the message today, where we look at CIM and consumer EIM today, is that the worlds are really getting smaller in terms of differences, in terms of technological needs and requirements for these businesses. A B2B scenario is still looking for the joiner, mover, leaver scenario. It's looking for to get a new employee, assign a business role, he leaves the company or he moves business roles. In CIM, it's really more about how can I get that user to pay for my service as fast as possible without being as user-friendly and seamless as possible, or getting to new services. Where we see the new EIM challenges is in that B2B2C story, with the KBC and the cinema, for example, who's managing the identity. In the finance sector also, if you want to link your insurance to your banking account, who's managing that identity? And there in the B2B2C context, we really see a lot of new challenges for EIM, where we also have the problem of conflicting roles, where if a broker is accessing the insurance portal, for example, but delegates a number of customers, then who has access to the data of that end user? It's both the end user and the broker. But if that link somehow changes, who manages that? And who manages the access of the end user in general? So those B2B2C use cases are really tricky for customers to deal with, for IT environments to deal with, because they're quite new, and traditional IAM systems do not really give an answer to that. And so the solutions that are converging, on the left hand, we see a traditional B2B context focused on the perimeter, focused on high admin cost, role-based access controls, and so forth, with complex policies, hopefully some federated login to make it a bit easier. On the right, we see cloud-oriented, and it's consumer-based, it's cloud-oriented, it's an account-based, consumer is an account. We sometimes use social login, we have self-service, we have some bot detection. All these things around consumer EIM are there, but they're kind of getting into the middle with our zero trust story for a B2B context, but also token-based authentication, which was designed for consumer EIM, but is now also making its way into a B2B context. We have account linking, where we have identities that are part of different systems, but have to be linked together to become a true identity-centric solution. And we have more data analytics that's focused on anomaly detection, where we look at use devices and stuff like that, things that have been talked about throughout the days already. So I'm not going to repeat that. And so the new EIM challenges, some examples there usually have to do with being an identity for different companies, having some delegation that you need to perform. How are you going to solve that? So the solution where we work on with Trustbuilder is built around what's called in the industry attribute-based access controls. So we look at an identity in terms of user attributes that are sitting in whatever application or whatever identity provider that we can use. Hopefully European wallet in the future, but who knows? So we look at the identity itself. We look at context of that user, which application is he trying to access, which device is he using, etc. And then we also look at resource and action attributes. We'll talk a bit later about that. So when you combine a B2B and a B2C environment, it's tricky to have those roles, business roles, mapped to a consumer. Attribute-based helps there, where a role is also an attribute. So you work with, I'm an engineer, and if I want to access this application, that role becomes my attribute to get access into that application. This is, of course, in each scenario different. If you go from HR to finance, completely different. But the principles of using those attributes to get access to an application or a service are still the same. What's also useful in this kind of scheme is that we always keep the information where it's most relevant. So if a consumer has an identity database and they have an ERP environment and they have a CRM environment, we're not going to say, oh, we all mix that in one bag and we see what we get out of it. No, we say, you're used to working with that CRM, you're used to working with that database. We just use that information when we need it, when it's available to us, to make a decision on the authorization for that application or for that identity. That makes it a lot more adaptable for user as well, because they can just plug it in right now, leave their existing environment as it is today. We can add new identity providers, we can add new service providers to their environment quite easily. So if a customer wants to use It's Me in Belgium, but also IDN in the Netherlands, Bank ID in Norway, NemID in Denmark, whatever, we can put that within our platform and make it available to a user in a couple of days. So that's really the power of this model, that we can add new identity providers, add new service providers quickly by keeping this as a central building block. So the attributes that we use typically in our scenarios come from 3 different environments. They're either internal attributes, excuse me, they're either authoritative attributes, or they are third-party sources. So internal, the internal sources, they are what we typically use from an Active Directory, an Active Directory or a database where we look at some attributes from a user and we make a decision based on that attribute. So is a person a recurring customer? That's typically what we find in the CRM system. So that's the data point that we use for our decision. An authoritative source is this person 18 years old? This is actually one that we use with a gambling customer. So when a user onboards their web page, by law, they are mandated to make sure that that user is 18 years or older in order to gamble and spend money. And therefore, we check the Belgian National Registry, not to check the date of birth, but just to get the answer, is this person 18 years or older? So we validate the government IDP for that user, we get that information, and we can make a decision for the onboarding. We then also have third-party sources, like we do in the banking environment, with risk analysis, for example, where they have tons of data points on a transaction. They make a decision, or they spit out a score. We set a certain threshold, and we say, okay, if you're below or above the threshold, we require your Rabo pass or your whatever validation via mobile. Can be anything, basically. So that's really the power of that attribute-based access control mechanism, that although an identity can have multiple services from the same or from different providers, we can bundle those together and make a decision based on information that's sitting around in the environment. Now, an extension to that attribute-based access control is what we call persona-driven access control. And this is important to make this fine granular story scalable for millions of users. Why? Because in the problem that we have with typical attribute-based access control is that although it's very fine-grained, it also gets very detailed and very extensive if you want to apply it to many users. So the solution there is that we focus on delegated administration, where people can delegate other people based on a persona level, but also have self-service with validation parameters for other users to be used. This means that if we look at an employee, he can have multiple personas. He can be just a regular employee, but can be part of the HR management team, can be part of a legal team. And of course, the role that this employee has implicates the access that he gets within certain applications. And if a user has conflicting roles, then we might require more input from the user to say, okay, with which persona do you want to continue? An example that we have in Belgium, for example, where we work with the government, is that whenever you want to file for your taxes, you can be a natural person, but you can also be part of multiple KMO's, kleine en middelgrote ondernemingen. Sorry? Okay, voilà. And so whatever persona you choose then determines your taxes, basically. So you have to file taxes for different corporations, for your own person, for your wife, maybe, whatever. So we use that principle. Okay. And so we use that persona-driven access control for multiple roles within the same identity. What's critical here is that we separate the authentication from the authorization. So a role can authenticate with whatever IDP is available to them. I've now picked Belgian examples. It's me. Maybe the company credentials can be social again, like LinkedIn, Facebook, or Google, or whatever. However, that user authenticates does not mean what authorization that user gets inside an application. No, we separate that completely, and then we authenticate the user, we validate the identity, and then we look, okay, what rights does that user have within the application, depending on the persona, depending on maybe multiple personas. And that's a really powerful feature to have within an organization, but also within consumers. If you are a broker, but also an end customer, for example, if you're a student, but also a researcher within a university, if you change roles within, well, maybe let's go back to this one, actually. If you're, let's say you're a student at the start of your career in the university, you become an alumni. What most universities do is they remove your student account and give you a new account for your alumni role. If you then want to become a researcher or a PhD, you get another new account. So in terms of knowing your customer, you know nothing, but you just removed all the accounts that you had about that user. And that's the same in like retailing, in every aspect in HR and finance, where you want to really center your information around the identity. If you're going to work account-driven, then it's never going to work, because sometimes they just make new accounts or change their accounts, and you lost all your information. So that's a very powerful tool to just say, okay, I have my identity. Suddenly he stopped being a student and he became an alumni. I will just deactivate that persona. So his access permissions are revoked, but I still have the identity information. I still have all the information I need for future goals. And so critical is that self-service is central in these kinds of things. So another example is like in Italy, we work with a small loan bank where like bookstores or any type of small store can ask for small loans. They have a portal for that. The problem they had is that all the employees from the store had the username and password. They were just sharing credentials. Whenever somebody left the store, they had to create new credentials because everybody knew them. So it was messy. And so what they did is we created a portal for them where the administrator of the store can delegate their own users. So although the users are not part of the identity system of the bank itself, they still can make decisions for small loans on behalf of the customer. And that delegation and self-administration is really critical in these types of environments to make it work in a larger scale. So yeah, that's just the example I gave, where you have an administrator that can represent different sets of users, and you can have these multi-levels, and there really self-administration is key with approval flows and stuff like that to make it work. How it looks like in an environment, just to make it more visual for you guys, where you have a typical username and key pair, you have sets of identifiers, the ways that user can identify themselves, and within that identity, I have multiple personas to define my access permissions inside an application. What Stira then explained about open policy agent, that's something we also apply in our product. So based on the persona, we deploy policies to determine access in your applications. And then the access is done, of course, on the persona level. Maybe you're going to say, like, yeah, I don't really need this. I only have one persona or I only have one role within my environment. Then still, in terms of knowing your customer and being identity-centric, it gives you a lot more to play with if that identity or that role evolves or changes over time for that user. And the identification of that user is completely separate for giving his authorization within the application. And that's really, to wrap up, what we feel is the future for customer identity and access management, where in the past it was really focused on the technical integrations, having integrations with identity providers and service providers. We really feel like having a good bottom layer for your CM can be an accelerator for your company to get new business cases, to become identity-centric, to get new initiatives going without EIM being the bottleneck. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Wietse. A lot of people were taking pictures of some of your slides, so I guess that there is 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Let's see. Or everyone was taking the pictures to to get impressed again back home. By the way, KMO, that's the Flemish way to say MKB in Dutch.
Yeah.
And it's SME in English. So
Okay.
we all the 3 languages have 3 different abbreviations.
Okay.
For the same thing,
Small and medium enterprise. Yeah. Okay. Makes sense.
No questions? Okay.
We'll be here in the afternoon as well.
Yeah.
So if you have any questions, feel free to come by.